I want to show you a chart here that's going to sort of put it all in perspective in terms of invasive species management. These are strategies we've had in place for a long, long time. Actually, our traditional crop protection strategies in terms of excluding pests from other countries, whether you do or not. The first line of defense being pest-free, production of commodities overseas, pre-clearance at ports of entry, exclusion at our ports of entry, and then EDR, which is our second line of defense, and finally the third line, which is control, where we spend most of our time and energy actually. So if we can just make a good connection between what folks are doing here and what folks are doing here, I think we may come up with some better ideas on how to help each other do a better job with that. So with that said, we're going to talk about authorized introductions today. These are things that people want to bring into the country on purpose. They bring them in, they either get permission for it or they bring them in and they don't tell anybody. So we have authorized introductions and we have unauthorized introductions by mail and transport. And finally, intentional introductions that have become invasive, just sort of an overview of a few of those where we might think about how to look at these things for the future a little bit differently. There's a number of modes of entry of invasive species into a country, but almost in every case, unless you come across the border some way, our national ports of entry are our official gateways for trade and commerce and travel. And the modes of introduction through these ports, such as this one, this is the Port of Wilmington, which is not about 50 miles east of my office on the Carolina coast. You have intentional introductions and you have unintentional introductions. The intentional introductions are authorized shipments that come in various means of transport. And we have smuggled shipments that are in cargo and mail. Then we have unintentional introductions, which are stowaways, hitchhikers, and contaminants. We want to talk about a little bit about my experience in working with these at the Port of Charleston as I began my career. So the best thing we could do, and based on my experience as a port inspector, would be to inspect as much of this foreign cargo as we can where it comes from. Inspect it at the point of origin or the port of export. So you go out in the middle of China, someplace where they're growing a commodity, grain or something like that. You make sure it's pest-free. Or you come to the port of export at Shanghai or somewhere like that, or Hong Kong, and you inspect it there. It is a lot easier to mitigate these problems in the countries where they originated, such as the Port of Cadiz, Spain. It expedites the border clearance process at the port of entry. And I remember when I was an inspector, hearing about people would get temporary assignments in APHIS to go over to Cape Town, South Africa to inspect apples that were going to come into the U.S. at some port. Also going down to South America to inspect grapes. Grapes would come into the U.S. in various ports. And the idea being, if you inspect them there before they're loaded into a container and put them in onto a ship, then you don't have to inspect them again until you don't have to inspect them again, so they come in the country and they have paperwork that says they've been cleared. So it's either someone in the country who's a port inspector for that country, or we have someone on temporary assignment go there from the U.S. and do these inspections. So, it expedites things when it gets here so that you don't have to strip it out at the port and it can go right to the destination. And so that's the best of all worlds for everybody. So you do your customs paperwork, and we have the paperwork that says it's been pre-cleared over there. That would actually be ideal, and it's the most ideal thing in terms of pest exclusion that we might do. So some examples of this would be high-risk for agricultural and forestry products like fruit. So just imagine you get this fruit from South America, where they have Mediterranean fruit fly, and if you were to get these containers of cargo of the fruit into Miami or someplace like that, then you've got to inspect them. So if you can inspect these things over there, it's going to be a whole lot more effective. This would be the same with grain. I've inspected a lot of grain myself, and I can tell you that it would be really difficult to inspect all the grain to make much difference. And so if you can inspect it where it comes from, make sure it comes from an area that's certified in a warehouse, for example, in, say, Spain, that does not have the pests we're worried about, then it really makes the process a whole lot better, a whole lot more effective. We got a lot of wood into Charleston from overseas, and especially in our pallets and in our pressed wood packing, solid wood packing. And so I would hear about folks out on the West Coast getting shipments of lumber and logs in from Russia. So this is how you could get something like Asian longhorn beetle into a country. So we would want to make sure that wherever these trees came from, if they're going to come here as logs, you got to make sure that that area does not have the insects you're worried about. And that is what APHIS spends a lot of time doing in terms of working with industry to certify these types of commodities and so that we can keep these pests out of our country. Responsible agency that does this kind of work is the National Plant Protection Agency of the exporting country. In Australia, that would be the Australian Quarantine Inspections Service, which is equivalent to the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service of the U.S. and the Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security. And in Canada, that would be the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So everybody has their requirements, whether you're coming into Australia or the U.S. or Canada. And so these folks all know each other and work well together. What I'm hoping is going to happen is that we can find a way to make sure these folks and these agencies work more directly with the folks who are out in the country who are doing early detection and rapid response type projects. Because if we have certain kind of commodities coming in the country and you know you can't do a very good inspection, for example, because you've got a container and you've got to do a tailgate inspection, which means it's completely stuffed full of some kind of cargo from some country, and you know it can't be stripped out, and you've had experience in the past with that particular cargo being infested with some kind of pest, it makes a whole lot of sense to tell the folks in that state or province, wherever it's going to, this is something that's coming your way. You can actually ship it under bond so that someone could inspect it at the destination, and sometimes they do that. But what I would hope is that we could develop some kind of partnership between the folks at the ports of entry so that we could just follow the kinds of cargo and commodities that are coming in, so that not only you talk to the State Department of Agriculture in Wisconsin about this, but that the folks in the DNR who are concerned about invasive species and work especially on pests of natural areas, that they would know what's coming their way and not just find out after the fact 10 or 15 years later and wonder why Asian longhorn beetle has suddenly shown up, as it has done in recent years in Michigan, and I don't know if it's spread to Wisconsin, but I do know it has spread into Ontario, and they have a program to try to deal with it right now. And so the question is, how could we let people know in Ontario and Michigan, besides the State Department of Agriculture and the Ministry of Agriculture, how could we let other natural area management folks know about this? That is really my goal in talking to some of you about this, so we can generate a discussion about that. So some of our commodity classes that we have or actually have border clearance of authorized introductions are things like miscellaneous commodities like ornamental river rocks from France that would need to be certified before they left over there. And if we got that kind of commodity into the U.S., from my own experience, I can tell you I would want to look at the container it came in, the intermodal container, as well as the commodity itself for snails, because snails have a long history of being associated with this kind of cargo. Then we have certified commodities like meat from foot-and-mouth disease-free countries. And this is important. I remember in Charleston we had these folks who really, they did one thing, and that they were with the Food Inspection Agency. And I'm assuming they're still in, or they may be in Homeland Security now, I'm not really sure. But they took care of all the imported food products coming into the country in terms of inspections. And so they got endless amounts of certification, especially of meat, where it be coming from foot and mouth disease-free countries. And this is important because there's already been an arrangement between the U.S. and some other country to say, you can accept our meat and not worry about having foot and mouth disease. And so this is exactly, so we do a lot of paperwork like that at the port to make sure that commodities coming in that are really high risk, for example, beef or pork or something like that, that it would actually be certified as pest-free. Then we do precautionary inspections for hitchhikers, stowaways, and contaminants and miscellaneous commodities. And I have spent so many days looking at containers like this. And if you didn't hear the story last week, I'm not going to go through it again, but the story of the development of the intermodal container by Malcolm McLean, who was a trucker from southeastern North Carolina, which has really revolutionized shipping around the world. And it's the reason that China is able to actually outcompete so many countries more than anything else. They have such cheap labor there. But without these intermodal containers, there is no way that you could possibly ever ship this in terms of break bulk commodities from China to, say, a Walmart in North Carolina. So that's good for commerce, it's good for trade, it's good for the bottom line of companies, but it's been really difficult and it's further complicated our ability to exclude pests from other countries. This is something that happens accidentally. If you get containers from Italy, France, Spain, doesn't matter what's inside of them, you need to be looking on the outside for snails because they would crawl up on these containers over there. As I mentioned in my webinar last week, we had a big shipment of World War II vintage Army tanks in 1982 that came in from Portugal into the port of Charleston, and I was there when they arrived with the customs folks and immigration, and they were totally covered with snails. You could actually see them on the ship, which meant the ship itself was infested with snails. But this is an example of a miscellaneous type commodity that's infested with snails. Another thing I remember about was having certified commodities like brass artware. This is brass artware from India, and I don't know if they still get it, but we used to get a lot of it, and it always had to have paperwork with it that said it had been fumigated. And the reason they did this, and it was back in maybe the 1950s or 60s, they had so many problems with this in cotton piece goods that they actually decided that it's going to have to be a mandatory requirement that is fumigated before it comes in. So they fumigated it with methyl bromide at the point of origin. And so we would actually look at the paperwork, but then we would go look and see, did it actually help? Because sometimes they would fumigate these type commodities, put them right back in an infested warehouse, and then if you trust the paperwork, it generally would turn out to be true. But if sometimes you would find a shipment that was infested as much as ever. So the paperwork is a good idea, and it actually cuts down on the problems we have with these type of high-risk commodities. But you've got to actually go out and verify the effectiveness of the mandatory treatments that were put on in the country of origin. And I know in the mid-90s there was an international treaty about solid wood packing for this very reason. And so they said, we're having so many problems with this, you've got to fumigate it or heat treat it or do something to it before you take it to another country. You can't just put raw wood and make a crate out of it and put a machine in it and send it to San Diego from China to San Diego. So, but they found out really fast that you can put anything on the side of a crate that says, well, this has been fumigated. It doesn't really mean anything. You could even have paperwork with it it is good. We will never, paperwork will never take the place of those port of entry inspections that have to be done out there. So detection of hitchhikers that are picked up during transport is really important. I remember hearing about Africanized bees had gotten on some ships down in South Texas and then around Houston. And so you can even pick up things while the cargo is being transported. So there's a lot of reasons to continue our vigil, to keep it up high, to keep looking at these things as they come in. Because this is what we're faced with global trade and travel the way it is. We're threatened every day, 24 hours a day, by pests that simply just have another way to get around. So we've become the vector, unintentionally in most cases. Just a few examples of some intentional introductions that have gone bad. Everybody knows about the Burmese pythons in the Florida Everglades, and recently our son moved down there and took a job as a business banker, and his wife is a banker too. And the news is just full of all the efforts that are being undertaken now to actually have python roundups, and they're encouraging people to find these things and bring them in for a bounty. So this is something that really started because people put these things in the international trade in exotic animals. And so we have shipments of these things coming into Miami International Airport with lizards, snakes, and tarantulas. I remember when Steve and I were over in Tanzania in 2006, we were at the port of, at the airport, International Airport there, as part of our workshop we did for invasive species prevention for Global Invasive Species Program in December of that year. And we looked at these crates of turtles, and the turtles were going to Mexico. I can't imagine what anybody in Mexico wants with 100 turtles from Africa, but that's where they were going. So the question is, were those turtles certified by the folks in Africa to go to Mexico? Were they going to bring any diseases or anything? Because they were like for the pet industry. So there's actually most of the pythons that are recognized species of pythons are legally available in the U.S. We've had thousands of these imported since 1990. The Burmese python is actually now illegal. You can't bring it in. And I just read where if you're going to keep it now, you're sort of grandfathered into the system, but you've got to actually have a permit or like a license from the state of Florida or another state to keep these things. And so far in the past few years, they've captured about 600 of them, and as I said, they have a bounty out on everything else that's there. Now, another system that has been set up to try to help manage the intentional introductions of invasive species is our biocontrol system. There's a number of biocontrol agents have been brought into different countries through the years. And a few of those have gone bad, which prompted us to create a system to regulate the introduction of these things. And an example of something that made us do that is cane toad, which is actually native to Central and South America. And in the early 1900s, it was imported into Puerto Rico to try to control beetles in sugarcane, and it did a really good job. So they started using it in other places, but they found out that it really became a pest itself. And one place it became a really bad pest was in Australia. And you can see the size of these things. So they eat every kind of little critter there is out there. Every native animal that's smaller than them. I was looking at a video the other day where they would just sit there and wait for a mouse to come by, and they eat the mouse. So there is actually an international standard for release of biocontrol agents that USDA, APHIS, and other agencies like CFIA subscribe to. And the idea is with classical biocontrol is to suppress areas with natural enemies of a pest. So when these things come in the country, as we've said before, they don't bring their natural enemies with them. And so an example of that would be the cactus moth. So if you bring in cactus into Australia, prickly pear cactus, which was brought into Australia back in early 1900s, really as an ornamental, escaping into the pastures and became a weed. So this plant, which is native to Central and South America and also the southwestern U.S., is a really bad pest down in Australia. And that's when they actually introduced the cactus moth to try to control it. And it was very, very successful. An example of something that's very host specific. But then they introduced it to other parts of the world, and this thing actually became a pest itself. So this cactus moth is native to Brazil and Argentina, but it's not native to Mexico. So when they started introducing it in other places of the world, like in the South Caribbean islands and Puerto Rico and places like that, to control native cactus plants, it became a pest there. So then it was in Florida in 1989 and spread on up into the Carolinas as of like 2003 and 4. And the question is it going to be stopped before it moves out into Texas and completely decimates 50 or 60 species of cactus? So the reason I'm telling you that story is that that's an example of why we regulate the introduction of biocontrol agents. Where something can be a very helpful control agent in one place, like cactus moth, there's actually a postage stamp that's put national postage stamp in Australia in honor of the cactus moth. But we would have it on the top 10 wanted list in the U.S. in terms of it being a threat to our native prickly pear cactus plants. So an example of this was when I was working for a U.S. Geological Survey before I retired. I was invited to be part of the National Biological Control Technical Advisory Group. And this was a great experience. It really keeps you in touch with a lot of people. And in this case, APHIS sets up a committee, and they actually evaluate proposals by scientists to bring in biocontrol agents into the country. And so they have this committee called the Technical Advisory Group. And so after all the work has been done by the scientists who do field observations in the native range of a plant, for example, the prickly pear, and you find the cactus moth down there, you look at the near relatives of the cactus, and they do research on near relatives of your target species, the one you're trying to protect, in quarantine. So when you bring in something like cactus moth, you want to put all this in a quarantine facility like the one the USDA ARS has in Frederick, Maryland. And so what they would do would be to test all the near relatives of the cactus plants to make sure that the control agent that we think is so good in the native range won't eat something else here in the U.S. So once they do all their research, which can take a decade, it can take 10 years, then they make a proposal to APHIS, and then APHIS sends that proposal out to the Technical Advisory Group. And then if those people on that committee concur and APHIS agrees, then they approve it and they release it in the field. So an example of this is the South American sawfly that some folks wanted to use for control of Brazilian pepper in Florida. And this started really about the mid-90s, and it was before I was actually involved with the committee when they started doing the research. But they did research on near relatives of the Brazilian pepper in this research facility in Gainesville, Florida, and starting in 1994. And they found out that this sawfly only eats Brazilian pepper and Hawaiian sumac, which of course is native to Hawaii. So APHIS, once they got finished with their research, they made a proposal to APHIS, and then APHIS sent out this proposal, which we got in probably 2004 or 2005. And they sent it out, all the folks on the committee, and you can see here USGS, Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, Agriculture Research Service, and there were a couple of state agencies maybe involved with it when you were going to a particular state. There was also an opportunity for folks from Canada and Mexico to be involved with assessing these proposals as well. And the recommendations that came in from the TAG, the Technical Advisory Group, was to release this sawfly in Florida, but not to release it in Hawaii. And it was because we didn't want it to eat this native Hawaiian sumac. So that's the value of this research that is done before you even evaluate something like that. So, you know, Brazilian pepper is such a bad invader in South Florida. We need all the help we can get to control it. And if this sawfly works, it's just going to be that much better. But we don't want to turn something loose that becomes a problem on some near relative that is native to South Florida. So you also have phytosanitary certification of exported plant products, like Virginia peanuts. When you would send those out of the country to other countries, we would often fill out these kind of certificates saying that they were pest-free. And we would get a lot of these in the country too. And certain kind of commodities would require that they have these phytosanitary certificates. It would talk about, this would involve things like plants, seeds, bulbs, fruits, vegetables, cut flowers, grains, etc. And then exported plant products that might harbor pests like wool and peanuts and cotton. And we would, excuse me, we would either get one of these certifications, one of these certificates from overseas, or we would fill one out. And so we had a lot of wool that would come into the Port of Charleston, as I remember, and it all had certificates from Australia. And so they would actually put these things into a separate warehouse somewhere when it came in until we could make sure we had the right paperwork on it. So this just tells where the shipment came from and how it got here and if it had been treated or disinfected or anything like that. There's quite a process there to try to manage the introduction of these pests and diseases coming into the country. It's mostly focused on agricultural threats, though. So unauthorized intentional introductions come in by international mail. This is controlled by the Federal Postal Service, and what's probably better than in the old days is we now have x-rays and they can be scanned. And things can be opened by a customs officer and now by a Border Patrol agent, agriculture specialist. But just the sheer volume of this is going to make it impractical to look at everything. And so if we think we're 5% effective with inspecting containers coming in from overseas, I'm not sure what it would be if we looked at mail coming in. Are we 1% or 0.5%? I don't really know. So we really need better technology to help us find pests that are associated with mail. So we don't want to be intrusive and cause problems for people with their private mail coming from overseas. But that could serve as a really important pathway for introducing species. So we need probably better technology than we have to be effective in minimizing introductions through international mail. An example of an introduction that was brought in, who knows how it got here, but probably the northern snakehead has been regulated under the Federal Lacey Act for a long time, but there are folks who move here from China, and they want to bring in the plants and animals that they've used throughout their lives. And an example of this is the northern snakehead fish, which is now a problem around Washington, D.C. and Maryland in particular. And they think this thing was introduced, first of all, in an Asian market where it's actually used as a food fish to actually sell to people to eat. But also they release it into rivers in a part of a prayer ritual. And another example of this is Apamea triloba, which is something that was a morning glory that was introduced down in South Florida, that people would actually try to grow for like a vegetable. And that's another example. Even though it was a federal noxious weed, people would send it in the mail. So these things are sent in the mail or some way, shipped over here. It was first detected in Maryland in 2002 and eradicated. But apparently there's a reproducing population in the Potomac River, so we have failed to keep this out. And once an aquatic species is in the country, in a waterway, virtually impossible to eradicate. That is why it's so important to try to keep these things out to begin with. So we have to do a lot of public relations with these sort of ethnic groups of people who would come here from other countries, and they want to bring their plants and animals with them. And it's just not practical. It is not practical unless you have some system that would actually devitalize or denature or something, or make sure that the materials you're going to bring in are non-viable. That's the only way to protect our country and our manage the natural resources from these kind of invaders. So another thing that is a big threat is catalog and internet marketing of invasive species, especially from overseas sources. This is a special challenge for border clearance agents and land managers, because this stuff will come in the mail, and it's not like it's in a container someplace. It may come in the mail, and it would be difficult to detect that they've got a package of seeds, even though it's illegal. If it's not labeled and they don't know that it's in there, they can't look at everything, and so it gets right on through. Some of these things are not regulated. Some have clear economic value in other ways. Sometimes they're sold in traditional catalogs, and the key is education of companies and the public. So even if we have a really very strong plant regulatory system, I would say public relations may be just about as important as the person who is there trying to enforce or to actually carry out the system or implement the system, I guess I'm looking for. Because if people can find a way around the system, and especially now with the internet, and in 2000 we had I attended a meeting in Perth, Western Australia, and it was really about e-commerce. And of course by then people had started using the internet, and of course not like today, of course, but even at that time they were saying we had over 5,000 websites that were selling plants and animals around the world. And when I came back, we started a project with USDA APHIS before I actually transferred over to U.S. Geological Survey to start evaluating this, and to give APHIS a little bit more information about what was out there, what was coming here, and it's just another pathway. And of course they're going to use the mail primarily to move this stuff around. So e-commerce is another really big threat now in terms of plants and animals. Unauthorized intentional introductions such as smuggling by sea, air, road, and rail is another example. And we always heard about parrots being smuggled in from Mexico to the U.S., and it's just terrible. These people would put these things anywhere in their car to hide them. They would actually put them down inside their luggage where they're going to smother. It's costing a lot of money. People can make a lot of money doing this, but there's such a big threat because of the diseases they would bring in. So it's the second largest illegal border business next to drugs. They're stuffed into wheel covers of cars, engine air filters, sealed door panels. They're hidden in fruits and vegetables. It's amazing what people will do to make a little bit of money. And it's terrible what they're doing to these beautiful birds. And so this is a constant challenge for people at our border crossings on the south border. Another intentional introduction that's become invasive that as it was happening, nobody knew it was going to be a problem, and that would be the lionfish. And this is something that was introduced from Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean and the Pacific it's actually a beautiful, beautiful fish you can see right here. long as you keep it in an aquarium. And so in 1992, when we had Hurricane Hugo, the fish were released from an aquarium there in Miami, and now they've spread all the way up the coast to New York. So now this is a threat to our native marine fish like snapper and grouper. So the response to this in the past year or so has been a lot more research and to try to encourage people to catch as many as they can. And they also have a lionfish derby. Down in South Florida, if you ever go, you can, if you catch a really big lionfish, if you catch the biggest one on a certain day, they'll give you $1,000. So they realize what a threat this is to people. But like I said, once something like this gets here and it's in the water, it's virtually impossible to stop. And it's going to be interesting to see if they can ever even make a difference in the impact of the lionfish here in the southeast. Something that's actually in the ocean. The oceans are all connected, but it's so big. It would never get here. It would never come through the ocean all the way around the world. So that's what people are. We've become the vector. Another one of my favorite stories is that is now illegal. You can't bring Gambian pouch rats in the country, but they were starting to become a problem in the Florida Keys. And 6 or 7 years ago, when I was working on some of my online classes for invasive species management, I was featuring some information about the Fish and Wildlife Service and their invasive species program. And at that time, Michael Lusk, who's shown here, was in charge of the program. And so I asked him to send me a picture so I could put it on my course page. And he did, and he sent me this. And so I called him and I said, Michael, what in the world are you holding? It looks like a possum or something. He said, it's a Gambian pouch rat. He said, just look it up on the internet. I think you'll find it interesting. And so I really had never heard of the Gambian pouch rat before. Anyway, it was actually introduced into the Florida Keys about 1999 by some exotic pet dealers. They wanted to actually sell these things to people so you could put a leash on it, train it to be like a little chihuahua, and let it walk down the street. That was the idea. Well, they got loose in a storm, and then they started spreading on some of these islands. Grassy Key was the first island that, which is shown here at this location in the Keys. That's where they were actually shown. So the big threat in terms of invasive species is that this would be a huge problem, not only for the native rodent, excuse me, in the Florida Keys, but also it would be a citrus pest, and that would be a big problem up here in South Florida. But anyway, this is an example of something that you can, that is not all bad everywhere, all the time. It is. We don't need it here, and we should never allow it to come here again, for sure. But in Africa, this is considered a hero in a way, because they can train these things to find landmines. And so you can see they actually put a little collar on these things, and they go out and they put them in a cornfield to see if people have planted landmines. And this is in West Africa. And so if you actually look up Gambian pouch rat on the internet, you can find there's a foundation in Belgium that really promotes the use of these things. But of course they're talking about in Africa, not as pets in the U.S. They can also be trained to help detect the tuberculosis bacterium in the spit of people. In other words, you spit into a cup, and then it can tell whether you have tuberculosis. And in Africa, where they don't have a lot of money and isolated villages, it's really helpful to identify diseases like that. So this Gambian pouch rat, I just wanted to tell you, is a serious threat for the U.S. and maybe other places in the world that that would grow citrus. But in Africa, it's a great thing. So I just wanted to make a distinction that when we say invasive species, we don't mean these are horrible, horrible, horrible species. We just mean they're out of place and they don't belong here. Other examples that were brought into this country before we had a Federal Noxious Weed Act were kudzu, which was brought in 1876 as an ornamental porch vine at the Philadelphia Centennial. Chinese privet, which was used for 100 years, and then it's now spread throughout the South by birds. And then hydrilla, which was brought in 1947 as an aquarium plant. Now, kudzu and privet are too widespread to list as federal noxious weeds, so they can never be regulated. We don't regulate the introduction of them. And hydrilla is listed as a federal noxious weed, but it's pretty widespread now and probably could not be eradicated from the United States. One that we have been able to really deal with in the past 10 years, especially, is beach vitex, which was introduced by the North Carolina State University Arboretum for dune restoration, they thought. And it turned out that it caused more problems than it helped, and it crowds out sea oats and other native plants that actually help hold dunes in places. So when this was introduced and we heard about it in 1998, we told APHIS about it, and nothing really happened because there was no constituency at the time to deal with it. It's not a threat. It's not an agricultural weed. It is not a weed it's not an aquatic weed. It's something else. In this case, it's a threat to natural resources. So anyway, the next time we heard about it was when sea turtle folks, sea turtle volunteers in South Carolina were starting to be concerned about this crowding out sea turtle nests. And so as a result of hearing about this in 2003, I suggested that when they called me, that they set up a task force. So look up the Beach Vitex Task Force, and you can find the whole story there. This is an example of a response, an interagency approach to a new problem in which, because it's considered native to Hawaii, that it can't be listed as a federal noxious weed. Even though technically this thing is listed in Hawaii as native, it's actually from Korea. So I really disagree with the fact that it's native to Hawaii. It's 4,600 miles from Korea to Hawaii. There's no reason to call it native to Hawaii, but it's in actually botany textbooks and flora of Hawaii books. It says it's a native plant. Well, I think that's a misnomer. But anyway, that's how it is. So we use this task force as a way to manage this problem. It's an example of something that that our system fails, our plant regulatory system on the national level failed to be able to cope with. So technically, you could still bring this in the country from a federal perspective. You could bring it in because it's already here, technically native to Hawaii, based on what they say. But it is a state noxious weed in North Carolina and Virginia, but it's not in South Carolina because the folks there continue to argue that they should be able to sell it up there in the Midlands and and the upstate and the Piedmont, that it's not going to be a problem there. And so we have a number of local ordinances, county and town ordinances along the coast in South Carolina that prohibit it being sold and planted on the beaches there. So at least we can have either local, state, or national regulations to deal with these things once they come through our plant regulatory system, if there's no way to deal with them nationally. So I got involved with this thing in 2003 because it was starting to sprout from seeds on the beach. It wasn't just a plant that they had put there from seedlings. The last one I think I want to talk about today is crested floating heart, which is actually still available on the internet. It showed up in Florida as a pest about maybe 10 years ago, the late 90s, 10 to 15 years ago, and now it's in South Carolina. And this is Lake Marion, which is down near Charleston, and we have two lakes there connected together with a canal, Lake Marion and Lake Moultrie, 160,000 acres. They have 6,000 acres of this, so this is one boat ride away from Lake Waccamaw in North Carolina, where we live. So this is something that is could possibly still be regulated under the Federal Noxious Weed Act or the Plant Protection Act of 2000. But it has not been so far. So it's actually listed as a state noxious weed in North Carolina, just like beach vitex is. Oriental bittersweet is another one that would be really nice if we had known 100 years ago that this was going to become such a problem and we had a plant regulatory system. This could be something that you just wouldn't want to bring in the country. And now you can see how widespread it is in the East, throughout the East, everywhere except Florida just about. And so this is our friend Les Meerhoff, who is all wrapped up with dealing with Oriental bittersweet in Connecticut. And this is a picture of it showing that it's still being sold in western North Carolina, even though it's a state noxious weed here. It's not regulated in the 18 western counties of the state because it is considered too widespread to eradicate there. So it is regulated in the 82 eastern counties of our state. So, but it's really difficult for me to imagine how a person who buys this wreath at the farmer's market in Asheville, North Carolina, in the mountains, and then how are they going to know not to go back to Raleigh, which is 150 miles away? And because as soon as they get tired of that wreath hanging on their front door in Raleigh, they're going to throw it away. Then we could have Oriental bittersweet there in Raleigh. So it's almost impractical to regulate something in a part of one state when people really move all over the state. And this is why in Virginia they have regulated beach vitex throughout the entire state. They first of all regulated it in a few counties, and I think now the entire state, they say you can't have it anywhere. You can't use it anywhere in Virginia, which makes sense. If you're going to regulate it someplace, regulate it in every place you can. And of course, you can see they used that for the iPain logo in Basic Plant Atlas of New England. So anyway, we want to invite you to join us next week for our next webinar, which is going to be on strategies for partnership development for EDRR. And then next Thursday, we'll continue this series here by talking about exclusion measures for minimizing unintentional introductions. These are like hitchhikers, like snails. How we actually do that. Here's a picture. Here's a link to our webinar schedule on the IPC Solutions on the Invasive Plant Control website. And we got recorded webinars, as Steve said, to begin with. I just want to leave a couple more things with you. There's 32,459 more weeds in the world that we don't have here that we know about. And unless we really support our folks at the port of entry to figure out what these are and to regulate them, they're going to come sooner or later, maybe not in our lifetimes, but we have 1,300 that are causing $50 billion in damages and control costs. We just really can't afford anymore. So I want to leave one last thought with you. You like The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells? You remember how the Martians finally died? It was really because nothing we did about it. It was really the diseases here that killed them all. So with that in mind, I got to tell you, one of my favorite shows growing up was Star Trek. And I think now that I work on invasive species, it may be the most unrealistic show that was ever created for TV and movies. Because if you can imagine the way it is right here on our planet, that we can't move species between continents, between biogeographical realms, the 7 biogeographical realms here. Do you think we can go to another galaxy like the Black Eye Galaxy, which is 17 million light years from here, and just interact with them like the Vulcans and the Klingons and the people from here? I don't know. And of course, we will never know until they try to do it. But it's just a real big concern to me that maybe we're on our island and this is our island and it's not practical to interact. I don't know, but I just think it's, and I have no way of telling you whether there's anything to this, but it just seems odd that if we can't mix up things here, we can't do it in other places too. So that's it for today, and I want you to take a look at the online tools that Steve and Lee have developed to help you manage your projects, including IPC Connect for project management, IPC Logic to help give you control recommendations, and the one we're developing now to develop EDRR capacity, IPC Prevent. So thank you very much today, and please join me again on Tuesday for our next webinar. You're going to love it.
Okay, thanks, Randy. There are several questions. I'm going to probably have you just answer some of them through emails, but I'll ask one that was asked early on, just close to noon. I know a lot of people have to pop off at noon. What's the level of inspection for private pleasure craft entering the U.S. waters? Is there inspection of materials coming from U.S. territories?
From U.S. territories, you mean like from Virgin Islands or somewhere like that?
Yeah.
I remember, I don't know about other places, we didn't get very much of that in Charleston, but I remember one time we did go out to a boat that had come in from someplace else, and so if they are actually notified that it's something that's coming in, I'm pretty sure if it's coming from the Bahamas, state of Palm Beach or somewhere like that, they have to go through an inspection like every place else, and I can't imagine them not, because if you are informing customs you're coming from another country, you're going to have to go through it whether you're on a commercial plane or a ship, whether you're on a private ship or something like that.
I guess there's probably the regulations. It's just a matter of how easy it is to actually perform that regulatory service.
Right.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining today. For the other questions, I'll pass those on to Randy, and he can get back with you via email.
Yeah. Yes, please let me know if you have any questions about this. I'd love to talk to some of you. Some of you have been with us for like 8 or 9 webinars so far in the last month, so I'm hoping that we can actually talk one day, and because I want to hear about your programs that you're actually doing. So thanks for taking the time to join us.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.